Welcome to The Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we're going to drift through 1,000 years of crowns and quiet legacy, the story of the British royal family. Imagine, if you will, an ancient hall at night. The air is still, heavy with the weight of centuries. Flickering candlelight dances across stone walls, casting long shadows that seem to breathe with memory. High above, portraits gaze down from gilded frames, faces of kings and queens, their eyes following you through the darkness. Each painting holds a story, each frame a lifetime, each silence the echo of 1,000 voices now stilled. The floorboards creak beneath your feet as you walk through this gallery of time. Dust motes float in thin beams of moonlight that slip through tall windows. Outside, the world sleeps, but here, in this hushed space, history waits. It doesn't shout. It does not demand. It simply is. Patient, eternal, watching. And now, as the candles burn lower and the night deepens, we begin our journey backward through time. The present fades like mist. The modern world dissolves. We drift through decades, then centuries, moving ever backward toward a distant shore where everything began. The year is 1066. The place is England. And across a grey, churning sea, a fleet approaches. The water was cold that autumn. The channel stretched between two worlds, one ending, one beginning. On wooden ships men stood silent, watching the white cliffs rise from the mist. They had crossed from Normandy, these warriors, following a duke who believed a crown awaited him across the water. William was his name, though history would add another word to it. He stood at the prow of the lead vessel, his eyes fixed on the shoreline. The wind caught his dark hair, and salt spray wet his face, but he did not turn away. Behind him, hundreds of ships followed, their sails like clouds against the autumn sky. In their holds, horses stamped and snorted. On their decks, men checked weapons and whispered prayers. The crossing took hours. No one spoke of fear, though it lived in every heart. The sea could swallow them all, but it didn't. The ships found beaches, and hulls scraped against pebbles. Men leaped into cold shallows, dragging boats higher onto shore. Horses were coaxed down ramps, their hooves finding solid ground, and William himself stepped onto English soil, claiming it with nothing more than the weight of his foot upon the land. The invasion had begun without ceremony, without announcement. Just men, horses, and the quiet determination that sometimes reshapes the world. In the north, another king waited. Harold was his name, and he wore England's crown, but not peacefully, not securely. He had fought battles before William's arrival, marching his army from one end of the kingdom to another. Now, exhausted and diminished, he turned south to face this new threat. They met at a place called Hastings. The battle lasted a single day, but that day changed everything. The fighting stretched through autumn hours, men clashing in waves like tide against shore. Shields splintered, swords broke, arrows darkened the sky. The Norman cavalry charged again and again, and the English shield wall held, until it didn't. Harold fell. History does not record his last words, his final thought. He simply ceased, and with him, an entire era ended. William stood amid the carnage as the sun descended. Around him, the field lay quiet now, save for the moans of the wounded and the cries of carrion birds already gathering. He had won, but the victory was written in blood and exhaustion. He looked toward London, toward the crown that would soon rest upon his head, and perhaps he wondered what he had truly gained. The coronation came on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey. The ancient stones of the church had witnessed ceremonies before, but this felt different. William knelt before the altar, and the crown was placed upon his head by trembling hands. Outside, his soldiers kept watch, wary of rebellion. Inside, English nobles stood silent, their faces unreadable masks. He was William the Conqueror now, though conquest is never complete. A crown can be seized in a day, but a kingdom takes years to truly claim. And so began his work. Across England, castles began to rise, not the romantic towers of later centuries, but grim, practical fortresses, wooden keeps on earthen mounds, built to watch, to control, to remind the conquered of their new reality. Stone would come later, but even these rough structures changed the landscape forever. Where once had been open fields, now stood symbols of Norman power. The White Tower in London rose slowly, stone by stone, year by year. It was not beautiful in the way of later palaces. It was strong, cold, deliberate, a declaration in limestone that the Normans had come to stay. William himself seldom smiled within its walls. Power, he learned, was a weight that never lifted. His reign lasted 21 years, each one harder than the last. The English did not love him, and he didn't expect them to. Rebellions flared and were crushed, lands were redistributed, churches were rebuilt. The Domesday Book was compiled, recording every hide of land, every plough, every penny of value in the kingdom. A bureaucratic masterpiece that served as both census and assertion of absolute authority. William grew older, heavier. He died in France in 1087 after falling from his horse during a campaign. His body was brought to Caen for burial, but even in death he found no peace. The funeral was disrupted, his tomb broken open centuries later, his bones scattered by revolution and war. The conqueror, it seemed, could not even keep what he had conquered in the end. But his legacy remained. The crown passed to his sons, and with it the fusion of Norman and English bloodlines began. William Rufus took the throne, then Henry, then Stephen, then Henry again, years blending into decades, decades into a new century. The Normans built. They established law. They created the administrative machinery of a centralized state. They brought stone masons who raised cathedrals that still stand today, their arches soaring toward heaven. They brought a new language that would meld with Old English to create something richer than either alone. And they brought the idea, the revolutionary, enduring idea, that England was not just land to be held, but a kingdom to be governed. That the crown was not merely a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be borne. The Norman castles stood against the sky, solid and permanent. Inside them, records were kept, justice was administered, power was organized. The feudal system took root, binding lord to vassal in chains of obligation that would shape English society for centuries. Years passed quietly in those early decades after conquest. Harvests came and went. Children were born and grew. The Normans and English began to intermarry, their bloodlines mingling, their languages merging. Two peoples became one. Slowly, imperceptibly, inevitably. By the time the 12th century dawned, England had changed utterly. The conquest was complete, not merely in military terms, but in the deeper, quieter ways that truly matter. Culture had been transformed, identity had been reshaped, and the crown that William had seized with iron and blood had become something more, a symbol of continuity, of order, of the eternal idea of kingship itself. The foundation had been laid. Everything that followed would build upon it. The 12th century opened like a new chapter, the pages fresh and unmarked. In 1154, a young man of 21 crossed the Channel to claim his inheritance. His name was Henry, second of that name, first of a dynasty that would rule England for more than 300 years. Henry Plantagenet brought with him something the Norman kings had lacked, vast continental holdings that made him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. He was Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Duke of Aquitaine through his marriage to Eleanor. His territories stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and England was merely one jewel in a crown of many. He was a man of restless energy, never still, always moving from castle to castle, court to court, border to border. His clerks struggled to keep pace with him. His courtiers exhausted themselves following. His kingdom was not a place, but a whirlwind, and he was its centre. Eleanor, his queen, matched him in strength, if not in temperament. Aye, she had been Queen of France before she was Queen of England, and she brought to the English court a sophistication and culture that transformed it. Troubadours sang in her halls. Poets dedicated verses to her. She was patron of arts and learning, and under her influence, the rough Norman court began to soften, to become something more refined. Together, Henry and Eleanor had 8 children who survived infancy. Sons who would fight each other for crowns, daughters who would marry into the royal houses of Europe. A family that was both dynasty and tragedy. Love and war, bound together and torn apart by the very power they possessed. Henry's greatest achievement was less visible than his castles, less celebrated than his conquests. He reformed English law, establishing principles that still echo through legal systems today. Trial by jury, common law, the systematic administration of justice, these were his gifts to posterity. In courtrooms across England, royal judges began to travel regular circuits, bringing the king's law to every corner of the realm. But power breeds conflict, and the church was still a kingdom within a kingdom. In 1162, Henry appointed his friend Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, believing he could thus control the ecclesiastical establishment. But Becket transformed upon taking holy orders, becoming defender of church privileges against royal encroachment. The two men who had been friends became enemies. Their conflict simmered for years, boiling into crisis and cooling into uneasy truce, only to reignite again. Finally, in December 1170, 4 knights who had heard Henry rage against his troublesome archbishop rode to Canterbury Cathedral. They found Becket at prayer in the twilight. The great church was cold, dim, filled with shadows and the soft footfalls of monks. The knights entered with drawn swords, and in moments that seemed to stretch into eternity. They cut down the archbishop before the altar. Blood pooled on the stone floor. The monks scattered in terror. And when Henry heard the news, they say he wept, though whether from grief or fear of the consequences, no one could say. Becket became a martyr overnight, his tomb a site of pilgrimage, his death a stain Henry could never wash away. The king did public penance, walking barefoot through Canterbury's streets, submitting to flogging by monks. But the damage to his authority, to his relationship with his sons, to his peace of mind, could not be undone. His sons rebelled, encouraged by their mother and aided by the King of France. Henry fought them, defeated them, forgave them, only to face rebellion again. Eleanor was imprisoned for her role in these uprisings, spending 16 years in comfortable but real confinement. The family that had seemed so powerful, so united, devoured itself from within. Henry's eldest son, also named Henry, died of dysentery at 28 before his father. The second son, Richard, would inherit. The third son, Geoffrey, died in a tournament accident. The youngest, John, would wait and scheme and eventually take his turn. In 1189, old, ill, and defeated by his sons one final time, Henry II died at Chinon Castle in France. His last words were said to be bitter. Shame, shame on a conquered king. But he had not been conquered by enemies. He had been worn down by time, by family, by the impossible weight of ruling an empire too large for one man to hold. Richard succeeded his father and immediately left for crusade. Richard the Lionheart, they called him, though lion is perhaps too simple a word for so complex a man. He was warrior, poet, strategist, dreamer. He spoke French and Latin fluently, English hardly at all. He saw England not as home, but as treasure chest to fund his adventures in the Holy Land. The Third Crusade consumed years of his life and vast sums of money. He fought Saladin to a stalemate, captured castles along the Mediterranean coast, won victories that were celebrated in ballads throughout Christendom. But he did not recapture Jerusalem. That goal, that holy dream, remained forever beyond his reach. Returning home, Richard was captured and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria. England was bled dry to raise the enormous sum demanded. When Richard finally returned, he spent almost no time in his kingdom, but rushed to France to fight King Philip, his former ally turned enemy. In 1199, at a minor siege of a minor castle, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound festered. He died days later, at 41, having spent perhaps 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. His legacy was glory, adventure, the stuff of legend, but little substance for the kingdom he had ruled in name only. John inherited a poisoned chalice. Where Richard had been brave, John was suspicious. Where Richard had been generous, John was grasping. History has not been kind to John, and perhaps he earned that unkindness. But his reign was more complex than simple villainy. He lost Normandy, Anjou, most of the French territories his father had held. England became truly English in John's reign, no longer just the western province of a cross-channel empire. But this transformation came through defeat, humiliation, the slow stripping away of continental power. John's barons grew restless under his heavy-handed rule. He taxed them mercilessly, trusted them little, governed through fear and favour. In 1215, they compelled him to meet them at a meadow called Runnymede beside the Thames. There, in June sunshine, with the river flowing quietly nearby, the most important document in English constitutional history was sealed. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, limited royal power, established that even kings were subject to law, planted seeds that would flower into parliamentary democracy centuries later. John never intended to honour it. He repudiated the charter almost immediately, plunging England into civil war. French forces invaded at the Barons' invitation. The kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse. Then John died, suddenly, at 48, possibly from dysentery, possibly from something darker. His 9-year-old son was crowned Henry III while civil war still raged, but the boy's innocence, his obvious need for protection, rallied support. The French were expelled, the rebel barons reconciled, and England slowly, painfully, began to heal. Henry III ruled for 56 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. He was pious, artistic, a patron of beautiful things. Under him, Westminster Abbey was rebuilt in the soaring Gothic style, becoming the architectural masterpiece it remains today. He was also weak, vacillating, easily influenced, qualities that earned him his baron's contempt. In 1258, exhausted by his misgovernment, the barons again forced constitutional limits on the crown. Simon de Montfort led the opposition, calling what is sometimes considered the first English to Parliament. But compromise gave way to war, and de Montfort was eventually killed in battle. Henry's authority was restored, though it never recovered its former strength. His son Edward was everything Henry was not. Edward IV was tall, powerful, ruthless in pursuit of his goals. He conquered Wales, building massive castles whose ruins still dominate the Welsh landscape. Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, monuments to military engineering and imperial ambition. He attempted to conquer Scotland, earning the nickname Hammer of the Scots, though Scotland would prove harder to subdue than Wales. Edward believed in law, but law as an instrument of power. He expelled England's Jews in 1290, seizing their property and appeasing popular prejudice. He summoned parliaments not to share power, but to extract taxation more efficiently. He was effective, but cold. When he died in 1307, still campaigning against Scotland, his son Edward II inherited an exhausted kingdom and impossible expectations. Edward II loved music, theatre, swimming, rowing, anything but statecraft and war. His relationships with male favourites scandalized the nobility. His military incompetence culminated in crushing defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce secured Scottish independence. His reign descended into chaos. His wife Isabella, humiliated and sidelined, eventually invaded England with her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, he died there under circumstances that remain disputed. The official story was natural causes. Darker rumours spoke of murder, red-hot poker, screams in the night. His son Edward III, only 14 at accession, eventually overthrew his mother and Mortimer's regency. Edward III would prove one of England's most successful warrior kings, his reign a golden age of chivalry, conquest, and cultural flowering. He claimed the French throne through his mother, Isabella, daughter of a French king. When the French denied this claim, Edward launched what would become the 100 Years' War, though of course no one knew it would last so long. The early years brought spectacular English victories. Crécy in 1346, where English longbowmen destroyed French cavalry in scenes of carnage that shocked medieval Europe. Poitiers in 1356, where the French king himself was captured. English arms seemed invincible, French chivalry humbled, the throne of France within reach. But war is expensive and victory exhausting. Edward grew old, his health failing, his beloved wife Philippa dying before him. His eldest son, the Black Prince, hero of Poitiers, died of illness contracted on campaign in Spain. The king lingered on, senile and ignored, while courtiers schemed around him. He died in 1377, his grandson Richard succeeding as a boy of 10. Richard II was artistic, sensitive, fascinated by kingship as ritual and symbol. He created a cult of royal majesty, demanding elaborate ceremonial submission from his nobility. But ceremony is not strength, and majesty is not wisdom. Richard's reign was turbulent from its start. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 brought thousands of rebels to London, demanding an end to serfdom and fair taxation. The 14-year-old king rode out to meet them, made promises, then broke those promises after the revolt collapsed. The rebel leaders were hunted down and executed. As Richard matured, he became increasingly autocratic, seeing opposition as treason. He exiled or executed nobles who challenged him. His paranoia grew until even his closest supporters felt unsafe. In 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke invaded England. Richard returned to find his kingdom lost. He was forced to abdicate, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and died there in early 1400, aged 33. The official story was starvation. Whether voluntary or forced remained unclear. Whispers of murder followed, as they always seemed to, with deposed English kings. Henry IV, the usurper, spent his reign fighting to keep the crown he had seized. Rebellions flared constantly. The Welsh rose under Owain Glyndwr, holding out for years in mountain fastnesses. The Percy family, who had helped Henry gain the throne, turned against him. The king's health failed, possibly leprosy, possibly something else. He died in 1413, still relatively young, worn out by the ceaseless struggle to legitimate his rule. His son Henry V transformed everything. Where the father had struggled for acceptance, the son blazed with glory. Henry V was the perfect medieval king, pious, brave, militarily brilliant, inspiring total loyalty from his men. He reopened the 100 Years' War with stunning success. In 1415, at Agincourt, his small, sick, exhausted army destroyed a French force several times its size. The victory seemed miraculous, a sign of divine favor. Henry followed up with systematic conquest of Normandy, siege by siege, town by town. By 1420, he had forced the French to accept him as heir to their throne. He married Catherine of Valois, cementing the claim. France and England would be united under one crown. The Plantagenet dream, centuries old, seemed finally within reach. But then, suddenly, stupidly, Henry died. In 1422, at only 35, he succumbed to dysentery while campaigning in France. His son, 9 months old, inherited 2 kingdoms and the hatred of a resurgent French nationalism. Henry VI was kind, gentle, pious, generous, learned, and completely unsuited for kingship in an age of violence. He suffered episodes of mental illness, possibly inherited from his French grandfather. He lost France, city by city, province by province, as Joan of Arc inspired French resistance and English will crumbled. At home, noble families grew powerful as the crown grew weak. The Duke of York challenged the Lancastrian king's right to rule. Factions formed, armies gathered, and England slid into civil war. The Wars of the Roses began not with drama, but with small, ugly skirmishes that escalated into full-scale battles. St. Albans, Wakefield, Towton, names that would echo through English history. Battles where Englishmen slaughtered each other in thousands, staining the snow red, piling corpses in frozen streams. Henry VI was deposed, restored, deposed again. Edward IV, the Yorkist claimant, seized the throne and held it through military genius and political ruthlessness. When Edward died in 1483, his 12-year-old son was supposed to inherit. But Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had other plans. The boy King Edward V and his younger brother were lodged in the Tower of London for their protection. They were seen less and less, then not at all. Richard was crowned Richard III, claiming his nephews were illegitimate. The princes disappeared, and their fate remains one of history's enduring mysteries, though most believe they were murdered on Richard's orders. Richard's reign lasted only 2 years. In 1485, Henry Tudor, a Welsh noble with a tenuous claim to the throne, landed in Wales with an army of French mercenaries and English exiles. Richard marched to meet him. They met at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. The battle was small compared to earlier Wars of the Roses engagements, but its significance was immense. Richard led a cavalry charge directly at Henry, trying to end the battle with one bold stroke. He killed Henry's standard-bearer, came within feet of Henry himself. But Richard's crown fell from his helmet in the melee. He was surrounded, unhorsed, beaten down. The last Plantagenet king died in the mud of a Leicestershire field, calling for a horse, abandoned by nobles who sensed the tide had turned. Henry Tudor retrieved Richard's crown from where it had fallen. He placed it on his own head, right there on the battlefield, and the Plantagenet age ended as it had begun, with violence, ambition, and the transfer of power through conquest. But this time, something else ended too. The long medieval afternoon was fading into evening. A new age was beginning, though no one yet knew what shape it would take. Henry Tudor became Henry VII, and with him, the world changed. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, like dawn spreading across a landscape. The age of heavy armor and mounted knights was giving way to gunpowder and pike formations. The age of castles was yielding to the age of palaces. The medieval was becoming early modern. Henry was not a romantic figure. He was cautious, calculating, obsessed with financial solvency and political stability. He had won the throne through luck as much as skill, and he knew how easily it could be lost. So he rebuilt the crown's finances through careful management rather than warfare. He avoided expensive foreign adventures. He negotiated advantageous marriages for his children, using dynastic alliances to secure England's position. His daughter, Margaret, married the King of Scotland, a union that would eventually unite the two crowns. His son, Arthur, married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's powerful rulers, cementing an alliance with Europe's rising superpower. But Arthur died young, of illness, in 1502. The death shattered Henry's plans, but did not destroy them. A papal dispensation allowed Arthur's widow, Catherine, to marry his younger brother, Henry, preserving the Spanish alliance. The younger Henry was only 10 at the time of betrothal, 17 when his father died, and he finally married Catherine and claimed the throne as Henry VIII. The new king was not yet the tyrant of legend. In 1509, Henry VIII was golden, athletic, handsome, learned, a Renaissance prince who wrote music, spoke multiple languages, jousted in tournaments, dazzled foreign ambassadors with his court's magnificence. He was 18 years old and seemed blessed by heaven itself. Catherine was 6 years older, more mature, more serious. She had survived years of limbo after Arthur's death, living in England but not quite part of it, her status uncertain, her future dependent on diplomatic negotiations beyond her control. Now she was queen, and she took her duties seriously. They seemed happy at first, Henry and Catherine, but she suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. For a king who needed a male heir, this was catastrophe in slow motion. By the 1520s, Henry's eye had wandered to Anne Boleyn, a courtier's daughter, with dark eyes and a sharp wit. She refused to become his mistress as her sister had been. She wanted marriage, a crown. And Henry, convinced his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God for violating biblical law against marrying a brother's widow, wanted to be free. The Pope would not grant an annulment. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe, and the Pope could not afford to offend him. For years, Henry tried diplomacy, pressure, persuasion. Nothing worked. So Henry did the unthinkable. He broke with Rome. In a series of acts of Parliament between 1532 and 1534, he made himself supreme head of the Church of England, divorced Catherine, married Anne, and transformed English religion and politics forever. The Reformation came to England not from theological conviction, but from royal frustration. Yet once begun, it could not be controlled. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were dissolved, their lands seized, their wealth distributed among Henry's supporters. The physical landscape of England changed as great religious houses fell to ruins. Anne Boleyn gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but not the son he craved. Her sharp tongue and independent spirit, once attractive, now irritated him. When she miscarried a male child, Henry's patience ended. She was arrested on charges of adultery and treason, charges almost certainly false. She was executed in May 1536, her head struck off by a French swordsman specially imported for the task. Henry married again, days later, to Jane Seymour, a quiet, obedient woman who gave him what he wanted. A son, Edward, born in 1537. But Jane died of childbed fever days after delivery, and Henry mourned her genuinely, perhaps because she had given him his heir, perhaps because she died before he grew tired of her. 3 more wives followed. Anna of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait pleased Henry, but whose person didn't. The marriage was annulled after 6 months. Catherine Howard, a young, foolish girl who committed adultery and was executed for it. Finally, Catherine Parr, a mature widow who survived Henry and managed to maintain peace in his household during his final difficult years. By the time Henry died in 1547, he was 55, but seemed older. Illness and obesity had transformed the Golden Prince into a bloated, paranoid tyrant. His leg ulcer caused constant pain. He could barely move without assistance. But even in decline, he dominated England utterly, his will absolute, his authority unquestioned. Edward VI, 9 years old, inherited a kingdom transformed. The boy king was intelligent, serious, intensely Protestant. Under his reign, the Church of England moved decisively away from Catholic practice. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, establishing the rhythms of Anglican worship that continue today. But Edward was sickly, and in 1553, at 15, he died of tuberculosis. His death triggered a succession crisis. Edward had tried to exclude his half-sisters from the throne, naming his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as heir. Jane was proclaimed queen, but her reign lasted only 9 days. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, rallied support and marched on London. Jane was deposed, imprisoned, eventually executed. Mary became England's first crowned queen regnant. Mary was 37, deeply Catholic, determined to restore England to Rome's allegiance. She married Philip of Spain, alienating English opinion. She burned Protestant heretics by the hundreds, earning the nickname Bloody Mary. But her faith was genuine, her suffering real. Years of uncertainty, illegitimacy, and religious upheaval had shaped her. She died in 1558, childless, knowing her Protestant half-sister would inherit and undo everything she had achieved. Elizabeth I was 25 when she became queen. She had survived her sister's reign by being careful, accommodating, giving no excuse for persecution. She had learned patience in childhood when her mother was executed and she was declared a bastard. She had learned wariness when, during Edward's reign, Thomas Seymour had attempted to seduce her for political advantage. She had learned survival when Mary suspected her of treason. Now she was queen, and she would never forget those lessons. Elizabeth's religious settlement aimed for moderation. The Church of England remained Protestant, but retained enough Catholic elements to satisfy those uncomfortable with radical reform. She would not, she said, make windows into men's souls, conform outwardly, and think what you wished privately. Her court became legendary. Poets like Edmund Spenser and Christopher Marlowe wrote for her. Playwrights like William Shakespeare thrived in the cultural flowering of the age. Music, art, literature, and learning flourished as England grew wealthy on trade and exploration. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, returning with holds full of Spanish treasure. Walter Raleigh attempted to establish colonies in the New World, though unsuccessfully. English merchant ships sailed to distant waters, establishing trade networks that would eventually span the globe. But Elizabeth's reign was not all golden light. She executed Mary Queen of Scots, her Catholic cousin, after years of imprisonment and evidence of plots against Elizabeth's life. She fought a long, costly war in Ireland, attempting to subdue rebellion and impose English rule. She sent army after army to aid Protestant Dutch rebels against Spanish rule, draining her treasury. In 1588, Spain sent an armada to invade England and restore Catholicism. The vast fleet sailed up the Channel, supposedly invincible. But English tactics, bad weather, and Spanish mistakes combined to scatter the armada. Ships were wrecked on Irish and Scottish coasts. The invasion failed spectacularly, and England celebrated a triumph that became central to national mythology. Elizabeth never married, though she played the marriage game for decades, using the possibility of alliance to manipulate foreign powers and domestic factions. She called herself married to England, the Virgin Queen, wedded to her kingdom and her people. Whether this was genuine conviction or political necessity remains debated. Perhaps it was both. She grew old, ruling alone, her courtiers aging with her, the Elizabethan age becoming something darker, more melancholy. The final years of her reign were marked by economic problems, military stalemates, political uncertainty. The Golden Age was ending, though nostalgia would later polish it to impossible brilliance. In March 1603, Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace, aged 69. She had ruled for 44 years, seen England transformed from marginal kingdom to emerging power. She left no direct heir, but she had named her successor, James VI of Scotland, son of the executed Mary Queen of Scots, great-great-grandson of Henry VII through Margaret Tudor's marriage. The Tudor age ended quietly, with an old woman's last breath. But its legacy would endure, in language, in literature, in law, in the shape of English national identity itself. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns in his person. He rode south from Edinburgh, welcomed at every town, marvelling at his good fortune. He had been King of Scotland since infancy, ruling a poor, fractious kingdom where his authority was constantly challenged. Now he ruled England too, wealthy, powerful, the jewel of his inheritance. James believed in the divine right of kings, that monarchs answered to God alone, not to parliaments or people. He was learned, writing books on theology and statecraft, but impractical in governance. He spent extravagantly while preaching economy. He sought peace while his subjects wanted war. He was clever, but lacked judgment. His great achievement came early in his reign. In 1605, a Catholic conspiracy planned to blow up Parliament while the king attended, hoping to trigger Catholic uprising and restoration. But the gunpowder plot was discovered on November 5th. Guy Fawkes caught in the cellars beneath Parliament with barrels of explosives. The plotters were executed with spectacular cruelty, and November 5th became a national celebration of Protestant deliverance. Under James's patronage, scholars created what became known as the King James Bible, published in 1611. Its magnificent English prose would shape the language itself, its rhythms echoing through literature for centuries. It was perhaps the most influential book ever published in English, and it bore James's name, though he contributed nothing but royal approval. James also sent colonists to Virginia, establishing the first permanent English settlement in North America at Jamestown in 1607. The colony barely survived its early years, saved by tobacco cultivation and the eventual leadership of John Smith. But it persisted, and with it, English imperial ambitions in the New World took root. When James died in 1625, his son Charles inherited a throne already under stress. Charles I shared his father's belief in divine right, but lacked even James's limited political skill. He was stiff, formal, convinced of his own righteousness. He believed opposition was sin and compromise was weakness. For 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled without Parliament, raising money through questionable legal means that infuriated his subjects. He imposed religious reforms that seemed to many to be creeping Catholicism. He governed Scotland with equal tactlessness, eventually provoking rebellion. Desperate for money to fight the Scots, Charles summoned Parliament. But Parliament had grievances of its own, decades of accumulated resentment and fear. Instead of voting funds, Parliament made demands. Charles refused. The struggle escalated from confrontation to crisis to war. In 1642, England split. Some supported the king, loyalty to the crown and fear of social upheaval driving them to his standard. Others supported Parliament, seeing Charles's rule as tyranny and defending what they saw as English liberties. Families divided, towns fortified, armies gathered. The Civil War was not glorious. Battles were confused, brutal affairs. Sieges dragged on for months, starving towns into submission. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Then Parliament found its general. Oliver Cromwell, a minor gentleman and member of Parliament, revealed himself to be a military genius. His new model army was disciplined, professional, motivated by godly purpose. At Naseby in 1645, Cromwell crushed the royalist forces. Charles tried to continue the fight, but could not. In 1646, he surrendered to the Scots, who promptly sold him to Parliament. For 2 years, negotiations dragged on. Could Charles be trusted to rule constitutionally? Many still hoped for compromise, for restoration of traditional order with new safeguards. But Charles negotiated in bad faith, secretly plotting to escape and renew the war. When fighting resumed in 1648, even moderate parliamentarians lost patience. Charles was tried for treason against his own people, an act previously unthinkable. He refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, stood silent through the proceedings, defiant to the end. On January 30th, 1649, he was executed outside Whitehall Palace. When the axe fell, witnesses said a groan rose from the watching crowd, as if the world itself had shuddered at regicide. England became a republic, the Commonwealth, though that term dignified a reality that was confused and unstable. Cromwell dominated, first as general, then as Lord Protector, king in all but name, though he refused the crown itself. He conquered Ireland with ruthless efficiency, a campaign still remembered with bitterness. He waged war on the Dutch, establishing English naval supremacy. He died in 1658, having remade England, but unable to create a system that could survive without him. His son Richard succeeded him, but lacked Oliver's authority and ability. The Commonwealth collapsed into chaos. By 1660, even Cromwell's supporters admitted the experiment had failed. England needed a king. Charles II, son of the executed king, was invited to return from exile. He rode into London on his 30th birthday, May 29, 1660, to scenes of wild celebration. The monarchy was restored. The interregnum over, order seemingly returned. Charles II was clever, cynical, determined never to go on his travels again, as he put it. He balanced factions, kept Parliament reasonably content, avoided his father's mistakes. His court was licentious, a reaction against Puritan solemnity. Theatre reopened. Fashions became extravagant. The king kept numerous mistresses and acknowledged multiple illegitimate children. But beneath the surface gaiety, serious questions remained. Charles was secretly Catholic, a fact that would have cost him his throne had it been known. His heir, his brother James, was openly Catholic, and most English Protestants dreaded his succession. When Charles died in 1685, receiving Catholic last rites on his deathbed, James II became king at 51. James was honest where Charles had been devious, but honesty in the service of Catholicism terrified his subjects. He appointed Catholics to high office, dispensed with laws requiring Protestant oaths, maintained a standing army that looked like the beginning of despotism. In 1688, James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, creating a Catholic heir and threatening a Catholic dynasty. English Protestant leaders had endured James, expecting his Protestant daughters would inherit. Now their patience ended. 7 prominent men sent a secret invitation to William of Orange, James's son-in-law, married to James's eldest daughter, Mary. William landed in England with a Dutch army in November 1688. James's support collapsed. His army deserted. He fled to France, abandoning the throne without a fight. This was the glorious Revolution, glorious because it was relatively bloodless in England itself, though Ireland would pay in blood for James's attempt to use it as a base for restoration. William and Mary were offered the crown jointly, but only after accepting a Declaration of Rights limiting royal power. England was becoming a constitutional monarchy, though the process was gradual and its endpoint not yet clear. Parliament's power grew. The Crown's prerogatives shrank. Political parties began to form. Whigs and Tories, names that endure today in altered form. Mary died of smallpox in 1694, leaving William to rule alone until 1702. He was never popular in England, always seemed more Dutch than English, always prioritizing European politics over English interests. But he gave England stability and kept James II from returning. William died childless. Mary's younger sister, Anne, became queen, the last Stuart monarch. Anne suffered more than a dozen pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths. Only one child, the Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy, and he died at age 11. Anne's inability to produce an heir haunted her reign. Under Anne, Britain fought the War of Spanish Succession, and John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, won spectacular victories at Blenheim and Ramillies, establishing British military reputation on the continent. In 1707, the Act of Union formally united England and Scotland into Great Britain, ending Scottish independence, but creating a larger, more powerful state. Anne died in 1714, aged 49, exhausted by illness and grief. With her, the Stuart Line ended. The crown passed to her distant German cousin, the Elector of Hanover, because he was the nearest Protestant heir. The days of hereditary right determining succession absolutely were over. Religion and Parliament's will now mattered more than blood. George I arrived from Hanover, unable to speak English, uninterested in learning, uncomfortable with his new kingdom. He was 54, accustomed to ruling his small German electorate, unprepared for the complexities of British politics. He left governance largely to his ministers, establishing a precedent that would gradually transform Britain's constitution. Robert Walpole emerged as the dominant minister, serving from 1721 to 1742, in what is often considered the first prime ministership. Though the title did not yet officially exist, Walpole managed Parliament through patronage and pragmatism. He avoided expensive wars, promoted trade, kept taxes low. Under him, Britain grew wealthy and stable. George I died in 1727 during a journey to Hanover. His son, George II, who had hated his father, proved similar in many ways. German-speaking, primarily interested in European affairs, content to let ministers handle domestic politics. Under George II, Britain expanded its empire. Victory in the 7 Years' War, particularly the capture of Quebec in 1759, secured Canada and established British dominance in North America. Britain also extended control in India, where the East India Company became increasingly powerful, blurring lines between commercial enterprise and imperial rule. The king died in 1760, and his grandson, who became George III, inherited at 22. George III spoke English as his first language, considered himself thoroughly British, and intended to rule more actively than his grandfather or great-grandfather. He was conscientious, moral, devoted to duty and to his wife Charlotte, with whom he had 15 children in a genuinely affectionate marriage. But he was also stubborn, struggled with what we now believe was porphyria, causing periodic mental illness, and his active involvement in politics antagonized those who had grown comfortable with the previous George's detachment. The great crisis of his reign came in America. The 13 colonies, prosperous and increasingly self-confident, chafed under parliamentary taxation and British restrictions. Protest escalated to resistance, resistance to rebellion, rebellion to declaration of independence in 1776. The American Revolutionary War dragged on for years. British forces won battles but could not suppress the rebellion. France entered on the American side, turning a colonial insurrection into an imperial war. When British forces surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, the war effectively ended, though peace was not formalized until 1783. George III regarded the loss of America as personal failure, but Britain adjusted, turning attention to other imperial possessions, developing trade with Asia, exploring the Pacific. Captain Cook's voyages mapped Australia and New Zealand, laying groundwork for future colonization. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, transforming European politics. What began as moderate reform radicalized into terror, regicide, and revolutionary war. Britain watched with horror as France executed its king and queen, dissolved traditional institutions, spread revolutionary ideology by military force. War with France consumed the 1790s and would continue, with brief interruptions, for more than 2 decades. Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from revolutionary chaos to establish himself first as first consul, then as emperor. His armies conquered most of Europe. Britain stood almost alone in opposition, protected by the Channel and the Royal Navy. Horatio Nelson's naval victories, culminating in Trafalgar in 1805, where he died in the moment of the triumph, secured British control of the seas. But Napoleon seemed invincible on land until he overreached, invading Russia in 1812 and suffering catastrophic defeat. By 1815, Napoleon was finished, defeated at Waterloo by British and Prussian forces under Wellington. Europe entered a long peace, exhausted by decades of warfare. Britain emerged as the dominant global power, its navy unchallenged, its empire expanding, its industrial revolution beginning to transform economy and society. But George III didn't witness this victory. By 1810, he was blind and insane, confined to Windsor Castle, lost in delusions, kept alive, but absent from the world. His son George, Prince of Wales, served as regent, governing in his father's name. The old king died in 1820, aged 81, having reigned for nearly 60 years. His life had spanned revolution, war, and transformation. The world he was born into, monarchs ruling by divine right, American colonies secure, France a rival but not an existential threat, had vanished utterly. George IV, who had been regent since 1811, was officially crowned at 58. He was cultured, refined, a patron of arts and architecture, responsible for much of Regency elegance that still defines early 19th century British aesthetic. But he was also self-indulgent, extravagant. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, a public scandal. His attempt to divorce her creating constitutional crisis. When George IV died in 1830, few mourned him. His brother, William IV, succeeded at 64, never expecting to be king, suddenly thrust into a role he had not prepared for. William was bluff, sailor-like, informal to the point of impropriety. But he was also decent, and he navigated the reform crisis of 1832 with more skill than expected. The Great Reform Act of 1832 was not democratization. Most men still could not vote, and women were entirely excluded. But it redistributed parliamentary seats from depopulated rural areas to growing industrial cities, extended the vote to middle-class men, and began the long process of making Parliament more representative. William died in 1837. He had no legitimate children, so the crown passed to his niece, Victoria, daughter of his deceased younger brother. She was 18 years old, small, solemn, utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. Victoria was tiny, only 5 feet tall, but she possessed a will that would shape an age. At her accession in June 1837, she was nervous, inexperienced, heavily influenced by her mother's adviser. Within months, she had asserted her independence, banishing her mother's household and establishing her own authority. In 1840, she married Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, her first cousin. It was a love match, rare among royal marriages. Albert was intelligent, serious, reform-minded, devoted to improving British institutions and society. Victoria adored him with an intensity that shaped both her happiness and her later grief. Together, they had 9 children who survived to adulthood. Through their marriages, Victoria would become grandmother to European royalty, earning the nickname Grandmother of Europe. Her children and grandchildren would eventually sit on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, Romania, Norway, Sweden, and Greece. Albert transformed the monarchy's role. He promoted industry, science, education, and social reform. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the magnificent Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, showcased British industrial and imperial might to the world. 6 million people attended, marveling at machines, manufactured goods, and exotic items from every corner of the expanding empire. But Victoria's happiness was fragile. In 1861, Albert died of typhoid at only 42. Victoria was devastated. She withdrew from public life, wearing black for the rest of her life, establishing mourning as her permanent state. For years, she rarely appeared in public, governing from Windsor or Balmoral, her Scottish retreat, leaving many to question the monarchy's continuing relevance. Yet the Victorian age was one of astonishing transformation. The Industrial Revolution reached full maturity. Factories spread across northern England. Railways connected cities, shrinking distances, enabling rapid movement of goods and people. Telegraph cables spanned continents and eventually oceans, revolutionizing communication. Cities exploded in size. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow grew from towns to metropolises in decades. With growth came squalor, slums, pollution, child labour, appalling working conditions that reformers struggled to address through legislation and philanthropy. Literature flourished. Charles Dickens exposed social injustice through novels that were also ripping good stories. The Bronte sisters wrote of passion and independence. George Eliot explored moral complexity. Tennyson was poet laureate, capturing Victorian sentiment in verse. Science advanced dramatically. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, proposing evolution through natural selection and sparking controversies that continue today. Michael Faraday pioneered electromagnetism. Charles Babbage designed mechanical computers decades before the technology existed to build them properly. The empire continued expanding. Britain acquired vast territories in Africa during the scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s. India was brought under direct crown control after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand evolved into self-governing dominions while remaining part of the empire. The sun, famously, never set on British territory. But imperialism had dark sides that Victorian Britain largely refused to acknowledge. Colonized peoples were exploited, their resources extracted, their cultures dismissed as inferior. Wars of conquest were frequent. Famines in India killed millions while grain was exported to Britain. The Atlantic slave trade had ended, but economic exploitation continued in new forms. By the 1870s, pressure mounted for Victoria to emerge from seclusion. Benjamin Disraeli, her Conservative Prime Minister, understood flattery's power. He convinced Victoria to be proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, appealing to her sense of imperial grandeur. Gradually, she returned to public life, though she never abandoned her mourning. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 celebrated 50 years on the throne. Her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 marked 60 years. Both were grand imperial spectacles, representatives from across the empire gathering to pay homage. Victoria was now an old woman, the longest reigning British monarch, a living link to a world that had vanished. She died on January 22nd, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She was 81, having reigned for 63 years. An entire age bore her name. The Victorian era had been prudish and hypocritical, but also energetic, innovative, expansive. It had seen more rapid change than any previous period in human history. Her son Edward waited in the next room, 60 years old, finally to be king after decades as Prince of Wales. The new century awaited, and no one knew what it would bring. Edward VII was born to be king, but his mother's long life meant he did not inherit the throne until 1901, at nearly 60. Victoria had not trusted him with state papers or responsibilities, considering him frivolous. Excluded from power, Edward devoted himself to pleasure. Racing, gambling, travelling, engaging in numerous affairs that scandalized Victorian morality but delighted the press. As king, Edward surprised everyone with his effectiveness. He was sociable where Victoria had been reclusive, diplomatic where she had been stubborn. He loved ceremony and spectacle, restoring pageantry to the monarchy after decades of Victoria's widows, weeds, and seclusion. His coronation in 1902, though delayed by his appendicitis and emergency surgery, was magnificent. Edward's reign inaugurated a decade often remembered nostalgically, the Edwardian Era, supposedly a golden afternoon before the storm. The reality was more complex. Society was changing rapidly. The old aristocratic order was being challenged by newly wealthy industrialists, by rising working-class political consciousness, by women demanding suffrage. The suffragette movement grew increasingly militant, women chaining themselves to railings, hunger striking in prison, even bombing buildings in frustration at Parliament's refusal to grant voting rights. Edward, traditional in his views on women's proper sphere, did not support them, but their agitation continued. Labour unrest troubled Edward's reign. Strikes disrupted industries, dock workers and miners demanding better conditions. The Liberal government, elected in a landslide in 1906, introduced radical social reforms: old age pensions, national insurance, progressive taxation. The House of Lords resisted, leading to constitutional crisis. Internationally, tensions grew. The arms race between Britain and Germany intensified, both nations building dreadnought battleships at enormous expense. Edward worked to maintain peace through personal diplomacy, visiting European capitals, cultivating relationships with foreign monarchs who were often his relatives. But his efforts could only delay, not prevent, the approaching catastrophe. Edward died in May 1910 after a brief illness. He was 68, having reigned less than 10 years. His funeral brought together monarchs and heads of state from across Europe, many related to each other, all playing roles in the intricate diplomatic minuet that was supposed to prevent war, but would ultimately fail to do so. His son George V inherited a throne that seemed secure, but a world that was anything but. George V was 44 at his accession, a naval officer by training, traditionalist by temperament. He had not expected to be king. His older brother, Albert Victor, had been heir until his death from influenza in 1892. George had married his brother's fiancée, Mary of Teck, and together they projected an image of domestic respectability that contrasted sharply with Edward VII's raffish glamour. The first years of George's reign continued the pattern of increasing social tension. The House of Lords crisis was resolved in 1911 when the Liberal government threatened to create hundreds of new Liberal peers, forcing the Lords to accept their own power being curtailed. Home Rule for Ireland passed Parliament, provoking Ulster Protestants to arm and threaten rebellion. Britain seemed on the verge of civil war. Then, in June 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe's alliance system transformed a Balkan crisis into general war. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war. Everyone expected it to be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years and killed millions. The Great War consumed a generation. British soldiers fought in trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, living in mud, enduring artillery bombardments, going over the top into machine gun fire in battles that gained yards at the cost of thousands of lives. The Somme, Passchendaele, Ypres, names that became synonymous with industrial slaughter. George V supported the war effort conscientiously. He visited troops in France, toured munitions factories, made speeches encouraging sacrifice. In 1917, anti-German sentiment became so intense that he changed the royal family's German name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, to Windsor, a thoroughly English name derived from the castle. In Russia, George's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, was overthrown by revolution in 1917, then murdered with his entire family by Bolsheviks in 1918. George agonized over refusing them asylum in Britain, but feared bringing such controversial refugees might endanger his own throne. Monarchy was not as secure as it seemed. The war ended in November 1918, Germany exhausted and defeated, its Kaiser in exile. Peace came, but at catastrophic cost. Britain had lost nearly 1 million men. An entire generation of young men was decimated. Every town, every village had its memorial listing local dead. The social and psychological scars would never fully heal. The post-war world was transformed. Women gained the vote, first limited in 1918, then full franchise in 1928, their contributions during the war making exclusion indefensible. The Labour Party grew stronger, the Liberal Party collapsed, and British politics reconfigured into the Conservative Labour contest that persists today. Ireland, promised Home Rule before the war, erupted in violence during and after it. The Easter Rising of 1916 had been suppressed, its leaders executed, but Irish nationalism had only intensified. By 1921, Britain was forced to concede Irish independence, though 6 northern counties remained part of the United Kingdom, sowing seeds of conflict that continue today. The empire reached its maximum extent in the 1920s, acquiring former German and Ottoman territories as League of Nations mandates. But the cost of maintaining this empire was becoming unsustainable, and nationalist movements in India and elsewhere were growing stronger. George V adapted the monarchy to democracy. He worked with Labour governments as graciously as Conservative ones. He pioneered the royal Christmas broadcast, first on radio in 1932, speaking directly to subjects across the empire in their homes. His voice became familiar, a source of continuity and reassurance in uncertain times. The Great Depression hit Britain hard in the early 1930s. Unemployment soared. Hunger marches from northern industrial towns to London dramatized suffering. The government struggled to respond effectively. George, troubled by the distress, cut the civil list, the monarchy's official funding, to demonstrate royal solidarity with national hardship. In Europe, totalitarianism rose. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Stalin in the Soviet Union. Dictators with absolute power, contemptuous of democracy, willing to use unlimited violence to achieve their goals. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, proved toothless. Another war seemed increasingly likely. George V died in January 1936, aged 70, after an illness worsened by his heavy smoking. His physician actually hastened his death with morphine and cocaine, timing it so the announcement could appear in the morning Times rather than the evening papers, considered more dignified. The king's last words were reportedly, "God damn you," addressed to his nurse when she suggested he would soon be well enough to visit Bognor Regis. His eldest son, David, became Edward VIII, and within the year created the most serious royal crisis in modern British history. Edward VIII was 41, handsome, charming, immensely popular. He had been a glamorous Prince of Wales, touring the empire, sympathizing with unemployed workers, projecting a modern image. But he was also shallow, easily bored, constitutionally incapable of putting duty before personal desires. For years, he had been involved with Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who was twice divorced. By 1936, his determination to marry her had become non-negotiable. British law and church teaching did not recognize divorce. The monarch was supreme governor of the Church of England. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and the Dominion governments all opposed the marriage. Edward could have remained king and given up Wallis, or abdicated and married her. He chose the latter. In December 1936, less than a year into his reign, Edward announced his abdication in a radio broadcast, saying he could not discharge his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. It was both romantic and deeply irresponsible. Edward left Britain to marry Wallis, lived out his life in exile in France, a sad figure, irrelevant, occasionally embarrassing the royal family with his Nazi sympathies and petty grievances. But at the time, the abdication seemed like it might destroy the monarchy itself. Edward's younger brother, Albert, became George VI, reluctantly taking a throne he had never expected to inherit. He was 39, shy, plagued by a severe stammer that made public speaking torture. His wife, Elizabeth, formerly Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, had initially resented Edward for placing this burden on his husband. But together, they would prove far better sovereigns than Edward could ever have been. George VI worked with speech therapist Lionel Logue to manage his stammer. It never disappeared entirely, but he learned to control it well enough to perform his public duties. His courage in facing this affliction won admiration and sympathy. The abdication crisis had barely settled when more serious threats emerged. In Germany, Hitler's ambitions were becoming clear. In 1938, he annexed Austria, then demanded territory from Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich, returning with an agreement he claimed brought peace for our time. Within a year, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain could no longer avoid war. The Second World War was fundamentally different from the First. Where the Great War had been fought mostly on foreign soil, this one came to Britain itself. German bombers attacked London and other cities in the Blitz, night after night, through 1940 and 1941, destroying homes, killing civilians, testing British resolve. George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, Elizabeth famously said she was glad, because now she could look the East End in the face, referring to the working-class neighbourhoods that had suffered heavily. The King and Queen toured bombed areas, spoke with survivors, demonstrated solidarity that cemented the monarchy's place in national affection. Their two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, were kept at Windsor for safety, but the family projected an image of unity and determination. The King's Christmas broadcasts during the war years were masterpieces of quiet courage, his stammer making his carefully spoken words seem all the more genuine and hard-won. The war ground on for 6 years. Britain stood alone after France fell in 1940, facing invasion that never came thanks to the Royal Air Force's victory in the Battle of Britain. Eventually, the Soviet Union and United States entered, transforming the conflict. By 1945, Germany was defeated, though the cost had been immense. Britain emerged victorious but exhausted. The empire was unsustainable. India gained independence in 1947, partitioned into India and Pakistan amid horrific communal violence. Other colonies would follow, the empire dissolving with surprising speed. Britain's global role was diminishing, its economy damaged, its people tired. George VI had been worn down by the stress of war and kingship. He smoked heavily, damaging his health. In 1951, he developed lung cancer. He died in his sleep in February 1952, aged only 56, mourned by a nation that had grown to love him for his courage and decency. His daughter Elizabeth was 25, married, mother of 2 young children, on a tour of Kenya when she received the news. She flew home immediately to take up the burden her father had carried, the burden her uncle had abandoned, the burden that was now hers for life. Elizabeth II was crowned in Westminster Abbey on June 2, 1953, in the first coronation broadcast live on television. Millions watched, sharing the ceremony in a way previously impossible. The young queen, serious and composed in her heavy robes and crown, made promises to serve her people for her entire life. She would keep those promises for 7 decades. The early years of her reign saw Britain adjusting to its reduced global role. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as an imperial power without American support. Decolonization accelerated through the 1960s, former colonies becoming independent nations, most choosing to remain in the Commonwealth, a voluntary association with the British monarch as symbolic head. The 1960s brought social revolution, Youth culture exploded. The Beatles and Rolling Stones became global phenomenons. Fashion, music, and attitudes toward sex and authority transformed. Britain was swinging, and the monarchy seemed increasingly antiquated, a relic of a vanished age. But Elizabeth adapted. She allowed unprecedented documentary access in 1969, showing royal family life on television for the first time. She modernized palace operations, reduced expenses, paid income tax voluntarily. She was cautious, conservative by nature, but understood the monarchy had to evolve to survive. Her role was apolitical, but not unimportant. She met weekly with prime ministers, offering guidance based on decades of experience. She had known Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, 15 prime ministers across her reign, advising them all with discretion that kept her actual views largely unknown. The 1980s and 1990s brought personal difficulties. Her children's marriages collapsed in succession. Charles and Diana's very public breakdown, with mutual recriminations and infidelities splashed across tabloids, damaged the monarchy's dignity. Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson ended in scandal. Anne divorced and remarried. Diana's death in 1997, in a Paris car crash while fleeing paparazzi, created the most serious crisis of Elizabeth's reign. Public grief was intense, almost hysterical. Elizabeth, at Balmoral with her grandsons, maintained her usual composure, believing privacy was more important than public display. But the public wanted visible royal mourning. Eventually, Elizabeth returned to London, made a broadcast acknowledging Diana's unique status, and attended the funeral. The crisis passed, but it had been close. The new millennium brought new challenges. September 11th, 2001, shocked the world and led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The 2008 financial crisis devastated Britain's economy. Scottish independence came close to succeeding in a 2014 referendum. In 2016, Britain voted narrowly to leave the European Union, beginning a years-long political crisis over Brexit. Through it all, Elizabeth remained constant. She performed her duties with dedication that never wavered. She met presidents and dictators, astronauts and artists, the famous and the obscure, always with the same careful attention, the same neutral courtesy. She made no policy, expressed no public political opinions, but simply was present, dutiful, permanent. Her jubilees were celebrated with genuine affection. The Silver Jubilee in 1977, the Golden in 2002, the Diamond in 2012, the Platinum in 2022, each marking milestones of service unmatched in British history. She surpassed Victoria as the longest-reigning British monarch in 2015, but characteristically avoided making a fuss about it. Prince Philip, her husband of 73 years, died in April 2021 during the COVID-19 pandemic. The funeral was small, restricted by pandemic regulations, but the image of Elizabeth sitting alone in the chapel, masked, maintaining dignity in grief, moved millions. She continued working almost to the end. In September 2022, aged 96, she appointed her 15th and final Prime Minister, Liz Truss, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. 2 days later, On September 8, 2022, Elizabeth II died peacefully, her children at her side. The news spread instantly across the globe. Tributes poured in from every nation. People who had known no other monarch found themselves unexpectedly moved. For 70 years, she had been a constant in a changing world, a link to a past that was fading into memory. Her funeral on September 19, 2022, was watched by billions worldwide. World leaders gathered at Westminster Abbey. The streets of London were lined with mourners as her coffin processed through the capital one final time. She was laid to rest at Windsor beside Philip, her parents, and her sister Margaret. An era had ended. Charles had waited longer than any heir in British history. He was 73 when he became Charles III, his mother's death transforming him from Prince of Wales to King in an instant. He had spent decades preparing, developing his own vision of what monarchy could be, sometimes criticized for his activism on issues like architecture and organic farming, but always serious about his future role. His coronation in May 2023 was both traditional and modern. The ancient rituals were preserved, the anointing with holy oil, the crowning, the homage. But the ceremony was shorter, less expensive, more diverse in its participants, reflecting a Britain very different from 1953. Charles became king in a world unimaginably changed from the one his mother had inherited. Climate change, artificial intelligence, social media, global connectivity, challenges and technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1952. The monarchy itself existed in a different context, its role more symbolic, its authority more limited, but its symbolism still somehow necessary. The United Kingdom was less united than its name suggested. Scotland's desire for independence had not disappeared. Northern Ireland's peace was fragile. Wales increasingly asserted its distinct identity. The Commonwealth had evolved into a voluntary association of independent nations, many now republics, connected more by history than by political substance. Charles brought to the throne his long-held concerns about environmental sustainability, interfaith dialogue, architectural preservation. Whether he would be able to express these interests as king, or whether the monarchy's political neutrality would require their subordination, remained to be seen. His wife, Camilla, for years controversial because of her role in the breakdown of his first marriage to Diana, was now queen consort, accepted if not universally beloved. His sons William and Harry, once united in grief for their mother, had become estranged, Harry choosing life in California over royal duties, writing a memoir that exposed family tensions with devastating publicity. The crown continued to pass, as it always had, but its meaning had transformed over the centuries. What had begun as raw power, William the Conqueror seizing a kingdom by force, had become constitutional, symbolic, ceremonial. Kings and queens no longer ruled but reigned, their power exercised only on ministerial advice, their role to counsel, to encourage, to warn, but never to command. Yet something persisted. In an age of rapid change, of political turbulence, of uncertain identity, the monarchy offered continuity. Coronations followed ancient patterns. State ceremonies maintained traditions centuries old. The crown itself, heavy with jewels and history, was placed on each new sovereign's head with words spoken since the Middle Ages. Whether this was valuable or merely anachronistic remained debated. Republicans argued the monarchy was outdated, expensive, fundamentally undemocratic. Monarchists countered that it provided stability, national unity, a focus for identity and ceremony that transcended partisan politics. The debate would continue, as it had for generations. But the crown endured, passing from head to head, era to era, century to century. The faces changed, the world transformed, but the fundamental idea persisted, that through one person, symbolically, a nation could express its continuity, its memory, its ongoing story. And so we arrive at the present moment, though even as I speak, the present becomes past, time flowing endlessly forward. The British royal family continues, as it has for nearly 1,000 years, though what it is has changed beyond recognition from what it was. Think back to William the Conqueror landing on that cold beach in 1066. He came with swords and horses, conquered a kingdom, built castles to enforce his will. Power was direct then, physical, brutal. The king commanded, and his subjects obeyed or faced consequences. Through the centuries, that power was slowly, painfully limited. Magna Carta restricted royal arbitrary authority. Parliament claimed rights and prerogatives. The Civil War established that even kings could be held accountable. The Glorious Revolution made clear that Parliament's consent was necessary for royal rule. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, the monarchy's political power evaporated almost entirely. What remained was something stranger and perhaps more durable: symbol, ceremony, continuity. The crown became not an instrument of power, but a representation of it, wielded by elected officials who governed in the monarch's name, but according to Parliament's will. The royal family became, in a sense, the nation's memory made visible. Where politicians came and went, prime ministers rose and fell, parties alternated in power, the monarchy remained, constant, familiar, performing rituals that connected present to past, linking generations through shared ceremonies and symbols. Is this valuable? Opinions differ, but consider what it represents. The idea that a nation is more than its current inhabitants, that it has a history worth remembering, that continuity matters, that something can transcend the immediate and connect us to deeper currents of identity and memory. The portraits in that dark hall we imagined at the beginning, they are not just paintings of dead monarchs. They are windows into the past, reminders of the long story that brought us to now. William the Conqueror's grim determination, Eleanor of Aquitaine's cultivated brilliance, Richard the Lionheart's martial glory, Elizabeth I's calculated majesty, Victoria's stubborn endurance, George VI's quiet courage, Elizabeth II's lifelong dedication. Each was human, flawed, shaped by their times. Some were capable, others incompetent. Some were kind, others cruel. They married for love or duty or political advantage. They had children who disappointed them, ambitions that failed, griefs that could not be consoled. They were not heroes or saints, but people, caught in roles they sometimes embraced and sometimes resented, trying to navigate the impossible demands of their position. And yet, collectively, they created something larger than themselves. Through accidents of birth and death, through wars and marriages, through betrayals and loyalties, They formed an unbroken chain stretching across centuries. That chain binds the present to the past, makes history tangible, turns abstract concepts of nation and identity into something concrete, visible, human. The crown itself, the physical object placed on each new monarch's head, is heavy with more than gold and jewels. It carries the weight of time, of all who wore it before, of promises made and kept, of duties fulfilled or abandoned. When Charles III was crowned, he joined a line reaching back through his mother, through generations of George and Edwards and Henrys and Williams, back to William the Conqueror and beyond, back into the mists of Anglo-Saxon England, into depths of history where fact and legend blur. Outside the windows of that imagined hall where we began, the world continues its ceaseless transformation. Technology advances at accelerating pace. Social structures that seemed permanent dissolve. Ideas that were unthinkable become mainstream. The future rushes toward us, unknowable and slightly frightening. But inside the hall, the portraits watch with calm, patient eyes. They have seen change before. They have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of empires, the transformation of ways of life. They know that what seems permanent will pass, and that what seems temporary may endure. The candles burn lower now, the shadows deepen. Outside, perhaps dawn is approaching, or perhaps night is just beginning. It hardly matters. In this place, time moves differently, measured not in hours, but in reigns, not in days, but in dynasties. The crown waits, as it has always waited, for the next head that will bear its weight. The story continues, as it has always continued, chapter following chapter. Reign following reign, one generation giving way to the next, in an endless succession that is both utterly ordinary and somehow miraculous. For 1,000 years the crown has passed. For 1,000 years men and women have borne its burden, performed its rituals, embodied its meaning. Some did so reluctantly, others eagerly. Some were transformed by the weight, others crushed by it. But all in their way contributed to the ongoing story, adding their chapter to a narrative that is not yet finished. How long will it continue? No one knows. Perhaps forever, the monarchy adapting and surviving as it has adapted and survived through war and peace, prosperity and poverty, love and hatred, triumph and disaster. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the age of monarchs is truly ending, and within a generation or two, the crown will rest in a museum, a beautiful artifact of a vanished world. But for now, tonight, in this quiet moment, the crown endures, the portraits watch, the candles flicker, and through the hush of centuries and the quiet turning of time, the story continues, not as power, not as glory, but as remembrance. The British royal family is many things, but perhaps most of all, it is a story. 1,000 years of births and deaths, marriages and betrayals, victories and defeats, choices made and prices paid. A story of people who lived in extraordinary circumstances, who bore impossible burdens, who tried to do their duty as they understood it, in times very different from our own. Their palaces still stand, monuments to vanished ages. Their portraits still hang in galleries, their faces gazing out across the centuries. Their tombs rest in Westminster Abbey and St. George's Chapel, stone remembering what flesh forgot. Their crowns and sceptres glitter in the Tower of London, behind glass now, protected from theft and touch. But the real continuity is not in objects or buildings. It is in the idea itself, the strange, persistent idea that one family, through generation after generation, can somehow embody a nation's identity, can represent continuity in a world of change, can be both ordinary people and living symbols simultaneously. Whether you find that idea beautiful or absurd, romantic or outdated, inspiring or troubling, it has shaped British history profoundly. It has given structure to politics, focus to national identity, continuity to culture. It has connected past to present, given children in schools something tangible to attach to abstract history lessons, provided ceremony and spectacle in times of celebration or mourning. And so, as we drift back toward our own time, leaving behind the long centuries we have travelled through together, one truth remains: the crown endures. Not through power, not through divine right, not through inevitability, but through consent, through choice, through the collective decision of millions of people across generations, that this strange institution still serves some purpose, still means something, still connects them to a story larger than themselves. The candles are almost gone now. The portraits fade into darkness. The hall grows quiet, and we return to the present, to our own lives, to our own time. But the memory of the journey remains, the long, winding path through 1,000 years of crowns and quiet legacy, of people who were born, lived, ruled, suffered, died, and left their mark on history. Welcome back to your own time. The story of the British royal family continues, as it has always continued, moving forward into an unknowable future, carrying with it the weight of all those centuries, all those lives, all those choices. It is a story without end, or at least, not yet. Rest now. Let the centuries wash over you like waves. Let the names and dates blur into soft memory. Let the weight of history become lighter, a dream already fading. For through the hush of centuries and the quiet turning of time, the crown endures, not as power, but as remembrance, not as command, but as continuity, not as glory, but as story. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the present awaits. But tonight you have drifted through 1,000 years of crowns, and that journey will remain with you, quietly, like candlelight flickering in a dark hall, like portraits watching from gilded frames, like the soft whisper of history breathing in the night. And so, through the hush of centuries and the quiet turning of time, the crown endures, not as power, but as remembrance.